the security complex is actually now recruiting these early years centers and kindergartens into this dynamic. Universities. This is where also we found in the reports from Prevent Policy that there was an abundant body of evidence that Prevent officers had disrupted or closed down events about Islamophobia or terrorism that had been organized by academics and campaigners. So anti-Islamophobia work is also targeted. National Union of Students activists told researchers that students felt spied upon when a Prevent officer demanded a list of names associated with the university's MSA or Islamic Society. So again, this sort of documenting and doxing of students on campuses there. And that's just a sort of small example of a lot of critique of that policy. But I wanted to now look at CVE in Canada, which is a little more emergent. And what we have here is from Canada has now the Center for Community Engagement and Prevention of Violence and Counter-Radicalization Coordinator as part of that as a federal office now. And the center is pledging $35 million over 5 years to support intervention efforts, counter-narrative campaigns, and research that will engage with communities and support local level programming through a community resilience fund and advanced action-oriented research. There's also, quite a bit of money, about 12 million in Kanishka funds for this kind of research in Canada as well, around counter-radicalization or de-radicalization, as it's often called. And so these are just some of the areas of the mandate. I won't go through all of those, but you can see that it is about, again, looking at a community-based effort to counter radicalization and looking at local programming in communities, in some cases looking at individuals who are in the process of radicalizing to redirect them from the path, and providing coordination on radicalization to violence and so on, and developing community resiliency. And I'm very, I really loved the way that Tracy talks about resiliency, but when I see it employed by the state, this term has become a code for how some communities are seen as predisposed to violence and racial and religious degeneracy, and our need to cultivate resiliency against these forces that are endemic in their community. So there's a big difference how we as communities who are interested in our own sort of liberatory praxis and engagement would look at resiliency versus how I feel the state is employing that term. And again, a concern is that white supremacist violence is mentioned in this report, but it's, or on this website, but overshadowed by the jihadist threat. Despite the rise in white nationalist Islamophobic groups in Canada and the Quebec massacre perpetrated by a white young male with far-right ideology. So even though we're seeing far greater threats emerging from the so-called alt-right and white nationalist movements, they're still getting fairly little airtime and on the website that is about this, this CVE program in Canada. And so I think that's also something for us to be concerned about, the way that Muslims are constantly being presented as the fifth column in Canada, despite the fact that we have a much more prevalent, and these white supremacist groups have now come out of the shadows of the internet chat rooms and are organizing publicly in rallies and gaining strength and solidarity from that kind of public camaraderie that they've gained. I also just have this brief note about how there's a program called Peer-to-Peer that the American Consulate is sending to professors in Canada. At least I've got it. I don't know why they think I want to do this, but this is a CVE program that they're offering you $2,000 if you will implement the CVE program in your classrooms. It's called Peer-to-Peer. And I don't know why they're barking up the wrong tree, but they keep sending me this stuff. So I don't know if anyone else is receiving this, but this is the incentive, and it's coming from the American Consulate. So there's an American-based CVE programming, because Canada is just sort of emerging in this area. But I think what we are going to see happening is that Canada is already involved in the international Five Eyes security networks, and and that is this sort of colonial and white settler nations: Canada, U.S., Australia, UK, New Zealand. And I think that Canada will start to look at other policies and practices going on in those nations to determine what will happen with our own domestic CVE. But it seems to be this network of managing the barbarians abroad and at home that we see as this just sort of, continuing kind of trope. Okay. So, I want to talk about this notion now. I mean, my concern has always been, as a sociologist in the work that I do, is what is the impact of all of this on communities and on youth. And so part of it is looking at this notion of embodied carcerality that frames this panel, and what I've been looking at as this idea of being under siege as an ontological status as well. And the idea of the carceral imaginaries that are created by this is a product of a panoptic society. And Foucault reminds us that the delinquent is an institutional product. The radical, the terrorist, the extremist, the jihadist are the new ontologies ascribed to Muslim youth that constitute them as violent, degenerate fanatics hell-bent on the destruction of the West. The construction of these archetypes leaves little room for Muslims to locate themselves outside of these sort of narrow and destructive topologies. And the categories that are purveyed without reference to the histories and complex geopolitical struggles that shape these terms, and without acknowledging the role of US foreign policies on the war on terror and creating the conditions for reactionary ideologies to rise into violent movements. Nonetheless, these new taxonomies of difference tell us who are to be watched, punished, and exiled for fear that they may disrupt our freedom, our values, and our nation. The boundaries of belonging and citizenship and those separating the desirable from the undesirable immigrants are anchored on these distinctions. Nation, citizenship, civil and human rights hang in the delicate balance between the fear and moral panic generated among good citizens towards the Muslim anti-citizen. So closing the degrees of separation between citizen and outsider is more than just a social or discursive shift. It's a political, legal, and ontological move. It severs the right to have rights as a seemingly inalienable part of citizenship franchise and constitutes new states of being outside the realm of the normative conditions of the rule of law and within this idea of a state of exception. I haven't caught up with the slides here. Okay, maybe I can wing it. Okay, state of exception. So I'm just drawing here from Gambin, who talks that, in this state of exception, the voluntary creation of a state of emergency has become one of the essential practices of statecraft, and that the state of exception has now become the dominant paradigm in contemporary politics. So what was once seen as a kind of, security measure for specific times of crisis has now become the normative practice of statecraft, and that this transformation of provisional exceptional measure into a technique of government leads to a threshold of indeterminacy between democracy and absolutism. And so the state of exception has now become a norm. Some of the hallmarks that we might see are things like the practices of rendition, both in Canada and the US, and the use of security certificates in Canada that have effectively led to the dismantling of the rights of non-citizens, things like the no-fly list. And I know there's things happening around that I won't get into now, but just those are part of that. And these are the state of exception. Also, if we look at the case of Omar Khadr, is, I think, one of the quintessential cases here, who, despite his age, was not treated as a child soldier and repatriated, but was labeled as an enemy combatant and incarcerated in Guantanamo. So he represents the quintessential carceral subject, in a sense. The radical is only to be contained. According to Henry Giroux, under such circumstances, quote, under such circumstances when the state increasingly rules with a state of emergency justified by an alleged attack on terrorism, the laws are suspended, democracy is slowly liquidated, and the brute power of authoritarianism descends on every aspect of public life. And I think that's certainly the case that we are seeing. And so the phenomenon of this panoptic society leads us to this concern of being preemptive, this idea of pre-crime and being preemptive. It's given rise to technologies of pre-crime, policing and surveillance, and the commodification of security. In discussing the notion of pre-crime, Zedner argues that governance is focused on actuarial calculations, notions of risk and precaution, prevention and surveillance, and pursuits of security. So criminology of pre-crime would shift the focus on reactive study of criminology and its systems to a study of the actors and systems in advance of criminal activity. So it's kind of like a Tom Cruise Minority Report reality here. And that is manifest in Bill C-51. Provisions of the criminal code make it easier for Canadian police to arrest people they feel may commit a terrorism offense. And it makes it easier for police to arrest terrorist suspects and bring them before a judge who could issue a peace bond and against them for up to 12 months or up to 5 years if they have previous terrorist convictions. And then that can lead to surrendering their passport, avoiding a curfew, participating in treatment programs, wearing an electronic monitoring device, and abiding by other restrictions. So again, this is also in effect with CSIS that now has powers of disruption to engage in disruptive activities such as detention, sabotage of vehicles, and disrupting communications like blocking emails or taking down websites. And so Foucault again reminds us that the carceral naturalizes the legal power to punish as it legalizes the technical power to discipline. And I think that's evident in the way these policies have been shaping up. So I want to just now talk a bit about Muslim youth, which has been the purpose of my research. And this notion of the pre-carceral net, and this is sort of the surveillance that's been specifically on Muslim youth associations. So there was a report in the US where the NYPD had been monitoring Muslim communities and for several months in 2007. The police went through student websites run by MSAs at Yale, University of Pennsylvania, Rutgers, and other colleges. And they talked with local authorities and professors and even sent an undercover agent on a whitewater rafting trip where he recorded students' names and noted in police intelligence files how much they had prayed. And of course, they found no evidence of any kind of suspicious sorts of behavior. And this is really something that I've, also encountered in my own life. My son was the president of the Muslim Student Association in his university, and the night he was elected, the next morning he got a call from CSIS on his cell phone. And the rest of the students didn't even know who won the election. It wasn't even announced to the students, but first morning. So, having coffee with CSIS has now become a thing that I get involved in because so many of the presidents of the MSAs are being called by CSIS or the RCMP into meetings, and I usually go when I can with them to these meetings. So there's that, and the phenomenon that we have of sort of being this, panoptic society of where we go to Muslim events and we play. It's like Where's Waldo? It's like spot the CSIS agent. It's like, who might it be? Is it the guy with the beard that we haven't seen before? Is it the curious white woman? Is it the guy in the tobe who doesn't really look like he should be wearing it? So, it is a thing. We actually do this. It's So this leads to the panopticon of self-surveillance, and this is, maybe this is, okay, anyways, I'll just read it, it's not there. But the panopticon of self-surveillance is something that I found as a dynamic within my research, and where the gaze, this regulatory gaze, is internalized and by the Muslim youth that I spoke to, and also in community organizations. Like not long after 9/11, the Canadian Islamic Congress put out its own information about a project called Being Better Safe Than Sorry on their website, providing tips on how to recognize extremist behavior among youth, such as excessive preoccupation with religious rituals. So the way the communities themselves have taken on board the security narrative is a whole other thing that I could speak about, but that's one example of doing that. And I always give the example of the youth that I've talked to who, this is the 9/11 generation, a group that's grown up under the specter of 9/11 and really doesn't know a world before it. But, if you ask them, how did 9/11 affect you? They say, oh, it didn't affect me. It's like, okay, so tell me what your student groups are doing now. Oh, well, we were going to play paintball up north, but we decided not to do that because we don't want to be seen as a terror cell. We were going to play, we usually play these like Call of Duty games in the concourse of the university, but we don't do that in public now because we don't want them to think we're plotting something. But 9/11 didn't affect them. Right? And it's because it's become this new normal. It's really become, they don't know a world before it, and they have been very much socialized into these kinds of subjectivities. So again, all of these processes of the security industrial complex and security archipelago are socializing youth into particular types of identities and dispositions and new ontological realities. So I want to share with you in closing just a few of the quotes of the youth themselves. And youth workers that I've interviewed. So this is Robley, who is a Somali youth worker, and he said, since 9/11, the focus has been on the religion and Muslimness, and what that means is vis-a-vis the press coverage we're seeing on extremists who use the Islamic language to further their agenda. They also become linked with regular Muslim youth. So Muslim youth now have to answer the questions of terrorism, extremism, and not fitting in because they are extreme. They don't all belong to these categories, but they now have to deal with all of that now. So in other words, being mapped onto their bodies, whether or not it has anything to do with their realities. And from the Muslim youth we work with, it's really affected them in different ways. If you're a religious youth who attend mosque regularly and want to have a religiously centered life, assumptions will be that you are an extremist. And we know that being religious and being extremist is not the same thing. Every time somebody blows something up in the world and they're Muslim, it's a reflection on their identity, and that could be stereotyping and assumptions made against them, and it will affect them in the workplace and schools. And so that is that collective burden of punishment, guilt, and labeling that goes on with Muslim youth. Okay, where did it go here? I'm just going to read you, I don't have too much time, so I'll just read a couple more, and we'll end with that, with the voices of these youth, and I'm just seeing what's up there. Okay, so this is Flying While Muslim. One student, Tarek, says, I was in an airport one time, and I was going to Friday prayer, so I was wearing an Arab dress, a thobe, and I was just dropping my dad off in the lobby. 2 security agents came up to me and started questioning me, as I wasn't even going on a flight. And Mahmoud says that, are you the kind we want, or are you the kind we don't want? They're trying to corner people. People don't want to lie, but if you have to go inside the country, and if immigration officer is asking you to pray 5 times a day, and if you say yes or no, this might just change your whole application. This might just change your, sorry, but I edited that. He said, but I understand why they're asking. I have to make a choice whether to lie and get into this country based on a lie, whereas my religion preaches the exact opposite, don't lie. And Zubaydah says that, I think the main place that I'm most sense my Muslim identity is at the border and the airport. When you're at the airport, there are supposed to be random checks, but it's almost never random if you're wearing a hijab. And she also goes on to say that at one point she was going to the US and she was with her baby cousin, and they were in an airplane, and they had a book written for children about how to fly an airplane. And we were like so scared. It's like, why did we pack this book? Everyone is scared because you feel that, they're always on the lookout. We're going to be judged. I should probably sit more nicely, smile more, so people won't be scared of me, And she says that in another case, she knows a family that whenever they're crossing the border or they're flying to the States, they always shave their beards. And once they get there, they grow their beards again. And so, when you're traveling, you always have to shave. I know I have a student who I was talking to who, she now takes her hijab off when she travels across the border, and this has become another way of accommodating to the realities of the surveillance society. So I'll close here with some of the voices of these youth, and I want to thank you for your time and attention.
Hello. Okay. I can be loud, but I don't need to be that loud. Well, it's an honor to be here. Thanks very much to the folks who invited me, Davina and Mike and the other folks. It's really wonderful. I live just across the border, actually. I work remotely, so I go to DC on a plane a lot. But it's nice to be invited to a conference in Vancouver and have a connection to what's happening here, especially working on the US right now. It's just great to leave the US whenever I can, mostly. And I am very fortunate to be able to do that. So I know I'm the last speaker of this whole thing, which has been a really, really intense conference. I know. And I was thinking about the name of this panel and the name of this conference, and it's interesting because I think for me, it's just, the US is a place that is just, it itself embodies carcerality. I mean, it is the most, it's the world's leading incarcerator. And the way that immigrants experience that, there's just no way removing that from the history of slavery and white supremacy in the US, and specifically hyper-incarceration, mass incarceration that happens in the country that's obsessed with the idea of punishment. And I think it's just been really illuminating to be at this conference and just be thinking about it in different ways and understanding that we're so comfortable in the US with the idea of incarceration. How can, and obviously a lot of us are working against it, but even within the communities that are working against it, we struggle so much to articulate what we actually want to see. And so first I wanted to mention a little bit about Detention Watch Network, which is the organization that I work for and I've been a member of since 2005, and now I'm executive director. And we started in 1997, so last year was our 20th anniversary. It started at a moment when really the paradigm completely shifted around immigration in the US, where prior to 96, we had more of a resident versus, or citizen versus resident versus non-resident experience. So people who are legal permanent residents, green card holders, had certain rights. In 96, with the passage of the 1996 laws, the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, and the Illegal Immigration and Immigrant Responsibility Act, it really shifted to citizen versus non-citizen, and that's when we started to see, before that detention was starting in the 80s, and really again in sort of a parallel track to the growth of mass incarceration in the US, but really 96 changed everything. And so Detention Watch Network started at that point, mostly white allies. Actually, probably everybody was white ally. Maybe there was, and they didn't necessarily think of themselves that way. And mostly, lawyers, maybe some people of faith. That was really what the organization was. Post 9/11, when obviously things shifted, that was when we had the laws in place. The foundation for targeting immigrants was in place completely with the expansion of mandatory detention and a lot of other policies. But then the money really came, and the money was funneled in, and Detention Watch Network shifted to, it started to shift, and there started to be more people who themselves were being targeted for detention and deportation. We became a national, formalized coalition in 2005 and started having staff. And now I think, for a long time, there was just this constant conversation of, well, when is detention okay? And that was, and especially for people who are in a very legal context, when is it okay to detain people? Let's use detention as a last resort. Last resort for what was always my question. What are we really saying? And in 2012, we actually adopted a vision of a world without detention. So we actually believe nobody should be detained, which doesn't seem like a radical thing to say at a conference like this, but I actually think it was a really important moment for our organization. And I think right now, as I'm trying to think about our strategic plan and our strategic vision as we move forward, really thinking about how we can educate our members. We have a national coalition of over, around 80 organizations, a range of people who are social workers or lawyers, but also people who are directly impacted by these policies. And how can we have the conversation about what is policing, what does prisons have to do in terms of relationship to migration, and how can we actually think about abolition in a broader context? And so we're there in terms of detention, but we're sort of figuring out our way. But I want it to be a very intentional process, so that's something that we're working on right now. So as I was saying, in 96, under the Clinton era, we had a system that was starting to change. The Bush era brought a paradigm shift in and of itself with the creation of the Department of Homeland Security and the intention of removing all removable people from the country. And then Obama brought a different moment, but at least on the surface, but we actually saw just an extension of a lot of Bush era policies. So I think there's a lot of attention on, okay, Trump is our president now. And what does that mean? And oh my God, it's getting so much worse, which it is. But the truth is, he's inherited this incredibly massive system of incarceration, a system that's really been, at least in the immigration context, not in the broader criminal justice context in the same way, propped up by the private prison industry. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, he's inherited the system. What does the system look like? And what are the things that he and the people who, and the Supreme Court and other entities that make decisions around what's happening with immigration, what are the things that are shifting? And then also a little bit of that, what is the resistance? Hopefully we can end on a note of actually in a way, for me, being an activist and an organizer for over 15 years, in some ways I feel more hopeful than I have in a long time, so I wanted to talk about that a little bit. So, in terms of the state of detention right now, we have, there's about 40,000 detention beds, 40,000 people being detained at any given time. Trump is right now asking for over 50,000 beds. And most of that is outsourced. I think there's only 6 facilities that are operated by Immigration Customs Enforcement. Everything else is outsourced either to private prison companies or county jails across the country. I think in 2016, FY 2016, which is like the latest numbers we have, about 360,000 people went through detention over the course of a year. People can stay anywhere from, a few days to years. And I think we're expected to see that to expand in terms of the length of time people are staying. It costs about $134 a day to detain somebody. There are family detention facilities, a very small number, probably a fraction of the 40,000, but a significant cost because you have women and children staying there together, and it's $319 a day to detain somebody in a family detention center. The detention budget right now is $2.6 billion. I think in the latest, the 2019 request was, I think, over $2.7 billion. And there are also, quote unquote, alternatives to detention, various conditions to release, which usually means just expansion of custody. It doesn't actually mean any reduction in detention itself. So I think there's roughly like 60,000 people under some form of alternative, which can mean anything from ICE check-ins to phone check-ins to an ankle shackle, GPS monitoring system. So that means with that number combined with the detention numbers, you have over 100,000 people in some form of ICE custody. And yeah, there's about 205 facilities around the country, mostly concentrated in the South, but there are a lot of facilities in California and some along the northern border as well. 73% are privately run facilities. And since 2003, which is when they started actually calculating or documenting this number, 179 people have died. There's a lot more ways people are coming into the system. In terms of the ways people are getting out, it's either being deported, very few people being released, or you're dying in detention. That's really how it goes. So in terms of detention itself, and then I want to talk about the resistance to some of these things, what are the shifts under Trump? So more detention. Obviously, there was actually a request for information for the expansion of facilities in the Midwest, specifically, like in different places expanding. I think it was over 4,000 beds that they made a request for in the fall. And in this latest FY19 budget, they're requesting 52,000 beds. So you would see a significant expansion. Under the Obama administration, there was a quota. It actually doesn't totally exist anymore, but it's at 34,000. So we have seen a huge expansion of detention. Under Obama, it was expanding a lot. It continues to expand now. Also, you have longer time, like people are spending longer times in detention, and that's actually shifted just in the last week. So there was a Ninth Circuit decision which is the left coast in the US, that basically said anybody who's a legal permanent resident who's been in detention for 6 months should have a hearing. And what they found was actually 2/3 of people were being released after the hearing. These are individuals who are mandatorily detained. The Supreme Court under Gorsuch and all the other people, and this is another impact of Trump and the fact that policies don't actually get made in Congress anymore. It's like we're just waiting for the Supreme Court to see what they do, but they rejected the decision and now it's going back to the lower court. So it basically means that indefinite detention is fine for these individuals. So there's no really limit to the time that people can stay. And there's also faster, on the flip side, there's also faster processing, so this desire to expand expedited removal, so increasing the number of people who can be targeted for that, so instead of having to go before a judge, they can just immediately be deported. If they came into the country within the last year and a half, they don't actually have to go through a judge. It's things like that where they're trying to shift the policy to increase the number of deportations, including increasing detention at the same time. There's less transparency. So this is an interesting one because in the Obama era, that's really what shifted. So Bush was this, let's expand like crazy. We're gonna have as many facilities as possible, over 300 facilities. Obama era was, we're gonna consolidate and have bigger detention centers that we have a little bit more oversight over, and we're gonna give you the information. We're gonna tell you where these detention centers are. We're gonna have an online detainee locator system so you can find your loved one. You don't have to FOIA, use the Freedom of Information Act to get everything that you want. And in a way, coming from an infrastructure, I think this is very different than Canada, where you have a very large civil society infrastructure. I work for an organization where I'm able to do my activism as a living, and in this context where you have a lot of lawyers, a lot of activists who are able to sustain themselves doing this work, having those little bits was like, oh wow, Obama's giving us this, we're able to have more information, but then at the same time, it's like, what is actually changing? We're getting more detention, and so I think there's been a struggle within the movement to feel like, oh, we got this little, this breadcrumb, but actual change isn't happening. So yes, now there's less transparency, but I don't know if, just sort of the significance of that is a question for me. And so that would be, one of the things that is shifting. Also, conditions are worsening. Immediately Trump was like, I want to, take away these national detention standards, which aren't even codified, so it doesn't actually have any meaning. But basically, from very little things to very big things, you have a lot of facilities where people don't even have outdoor recreation. You have a lot of facilities where people, whenever they don't even have contact visitation. So whenever like a loved one comes from 100 miles, 200 miles, flies all the way to see their loved one before they're being deported, they'll end up on video conferencing whenever they see them before they are deported. So that kind of stuff is increasing. And then lastly, but not least, you're just seeing a lot more criminalization. So a lot more people targeted, not just as targeted in general. So you have, there's a lot of conversation around gangs in the US right now and targeting people through gang databases for detention and deportation. Beyond that, but also you have a lot of prosecutions of people. So just, for entering the country. So it's not actually, quote unquote, illegal to be in the country without documentation, but entering the country without documentation, you can be prosecuted. In re-entering, you can be prosecuted and end up in prison for, more than 2 years. Which is this sort of segregated federal system that's parallel to the immigration detention system in the US. In terms of the sort of last piece I'll say about the shifts and then talk a little bit about hopefully something positive, is the way that Trump is doing this, so much of it happens through money, so appropriations in Congress. And the conversation has primarily been around the wall. And the wall means a lot of different things in a lot of different contexts. I know that there's been conversations about the wall in Palestine and different contexts of walls in the past, like in Berlin. But I think in this context, in a lot of ways, the wall is very much a symbol. And there's no real question about that. The US southern border is an intensely militarized place, and the impact of the wall is not necessarily, it's an awful thing, but in terms of the significance of impact on immigrant lives, it's already there, it's already happening. And in fact, the other requests that are being made around the expansion of detention, which, they're doing everything they can if they have the beds to fill those facilities as much as they possibly can, but then beyond that, it's this policing. So this is the desire to expand ICE and Customs and Border Protection agents. So initially when the executive orders came out, the request was they were saying we want to expand these agents by 15,000 over a period of time. Right now they're asking for, I think, 2,700, which would be $782 million to hire and support all those individuals. But really, whenever you have more people who can target more people, you're going to find more ways to lock them up, and that's really where so much of our concern is like, if you're going to build detention beds and you're going to have more agents, that's really what the impact is going to be. I think the wall is awful, and there's no question that we don't want the wall, but and the wall already exists in so many contexts on the southern border. But it's just one piece of the conversation, and I think sometimes that's something that gets missed. So, yeah, I wanted to, that's kind of where we're seeing the shifts. We're having more detention, longer time in detention, but also faster processing, less transparency, more criminalization, and worsening conditions. Those are the things that are shifting, though all of those things were happening before. How are we combating that? I think there's actually a lot of really, I mean, there's so many things that we can do. Like I said, with the resistance, there's like the legal apparatus of both litigation on bigger cases. So for instance, when you're talking about worsening conditions, the detention system basically runs on immigrant labor. So you have people working in these facilities, and usually they're only getting paid $1 a day. So for instance, in Denver, well, outside of Denver, in Aurora, Colorado, there's a Geo Group facility that there's about 60,000 people, I think, that they've, or 6,000, I don't remember now. But they've found a huge number of people to be a part of a class action lawsuit of people who were basically getting paid $1 a day to work in the facility. And so that's gonna be it's gonna be interesting to see what happens with that litigation. So I think that's one of the tactics is, let's litigate the hell out of everything to see if we can make any sort of impact. Although, when you're dealing with the Supreme Court that is what it is right now, it's a little hard to know how much impact that's gonna have down the road if things continue to get appealed. I think the other thing that we're really trying to do is, stop it before it can start. So site fights is really like one of the big strategies. Is, in these specific places where they're trying to build, let's do everything we can, whether it's using tactics from the Environmental Protection Agency or just targeting city council members or county council members or anybody that we can to say, we do not want these facilities in these places. And so we've been actually, having organizing teams go to certain places and say, okay, how can we support this community to fight back from this detention center either being built or being expanded in that area? I think that, in terms of the transparency piece, it was interesting right after the election where you saw the ACLU be this, like we're really here for the resistance. And I think it's true that where that becomes helpful, where having the lawyers becomes helpful is both the litigation, but also like Freedom of Information Act requests, like doing everything we can to use the tools that we can to get as much information as we can to then fight back, but not just wait to get, not just be in a place where it's like, okay, we have the information now, what do we do with it? And I think one of those ways is actually, we've been really pushing to get the death reviews, like, so after somebody dies in detention, get the information about what happened with their death, so that we can say, okay, these are the ways the system is failing, and these are people dying, this is why the system, it's a deadly system. You have stories of people who are having a heart attack and they've waited an hour to call the ambulance to come pick them up, and then they end up dying. And so that kind of story is something we've seen, and so everything we can do to get that information is gonna be important to push. Yeah, and so I think there's a lot of different ways that we've been fighting back. I think the biggest campaign that we have right now is around the appropriations and really pushing Congress. So you do have in the states this, Democrats in the states, not necessarily, there's not a lot of hope there. But at the same time, because a lot of them publicly say they're pro-immigration reform, and quietly they vote for these appropriation bills that basically fund detention, fund the wall, fund agents, we've been able to sort of push them and call them out and say, okay, you're quietly doing this, and you're saying you're doing this, let's actually put you in check and make sure that you're not voting for these appropriation bills that are gonna expand the system that much more. And so that's been one really big tactic of ours. And then the other thing I would end on, and then I'll just talk about a few activists. So I think one of the hopes I have is that after working on the issue of detention for over 15 years, I mean, it's such a hidden issue, and in the context of the U.S., like, I think now there's much more attention on incarceration, and I think, you know, we've started to see that over the years, and it's still sort of a marginalized issue. But I think everybody's sort of ready to do anything that's against Trump. Like, I think there's just like even if people don't really understand it, they're like, okay, if this is gonna go against what this awful man is doing, then we're ready to go there. And so one context is we actually helped draft a piece of legislation, a detention bill, that basically calls for the end of the use of private prisons. It calls for the end of the use of subcontracting, which would actually eliminate over 200 detention facilities. It ends mandatory detention. It's like one of the most progressive pieces of legislation I'd ever seen, and I was like, this is amazing that we've been able to get this introduced. And they actually came out, this happened in the fall, we actually were able to get over 50 co-sponsors in the House, and I think most of those members of the House have no idea what that bill says. They don't really understand what the impact's gonna be at all. But I think in some way, there's just like, oh, well, this is an anti-Trump bill. We're gonna co-sponsor this, we're gonna support this. And I think, despite the fact that there's like a lack of education and understanding, I do think there's this moment where we're gonna be able to go much further left than we've ever been able to go in the context of this administration than we were under the Obama administration, which was from the get-go, we're gonna compromise about everything. So I think that gives me a lot of hope in terms of where we can go, because ultimately, yes, we're sort of in this sort of civil society infrastructure trying to influence the US government right now, which is an impossible thing to do, but I think there's a little bit of hope that, you know, as we move towards abolition, can we make sure not to expand the system exponentially and make it even harder for us to get to that point? So I wanted to end on also, like, talking about a few of our members who, you know, when I think about embodied carcerality, they're people who are legal permanent residents with criminal convictions or undocumented, and have completely dedicated their lives to fighting this system. And in the last 2 months have been targeted by the Trump administration. So first, my good friend Ravi Rathbeer, he's the executive director of the New Sanctuary Coalition in New York. So he's somebody who has a past conviction. He spent some time in prison and then was in the Etowah Detention Center, which is probably one of the worst facilities in the country in Alabama. And he was also on an ankle bracelet for a long time, ankle shackle. And he was just going to one of his regular check-ins. He's had a stay of deportation, and on January 11th, he was detained at his check-in. Like, he voluntarily came to us, he was like, look, I'm here, and he was detained at his check-in, and then transferred to a detention center in Florida. And the world, like, I mean, it was amazing for me to see, and I think it's the impact of spaces like DWN and other spaces where the world just erupted, and there was so much energy in New York City among activists across the country around his case. Sorry. And luckily he was able to be released, a lot because of his lawyers who did an amazing job with his case, and he's still under threat of deportation, but you know, he's somebody who has dedicated his life to this, and he's like, this isn't about me. And it's been amazing to see his story unfold, and you know, he has a US citizen daughter, and it's been an incredible thing to kind of see the uproar around his case in particular. And then I wanted to talk about Jean Montreville. So he's from Haiti. He came here in the 80s. He had a drug conviction in the 80s, and he spent a few years in prison. And then he came out, he started a family. I think he has 4 kids US citizen children. And he was gonna be deported right before the earthquake that happened in Haiti. And he was, because of temporary protected status, he ended up not being deported. And this was, you know, he was just like living his life, but because he was a legal permanent resident with a past conviction, and because the 96 laws were retroactive, they targeted him for deportation. So then he was fine, and then on January 3rd, he was targeted by ICE outside his home. Like nothing had happened for years. And, you know, and he had a routine check-in plan for later that month. And again, there was like an uproar of folks, but ultimately Gene was deported on January 16th. And I think that was, you know, him and Robbie are very close friends, so it was really hard to see sort of those cases, but at the same time, so much, you know, resilience of community and support. And also thinking about Dr. James's talk last night about the grief of that, but like people really continuing to go. And then the other two folks, Maru Mora Villalpando, some folks might know her here. She's an organizer with the Northwest Detention Center Resistance, which is a facility in Tacoma, Washington. And she's, you know, she has like no open case, there's nothing, she's undocumented, that's it. And she just got a notice to appear from ICE in December. And it's really clear that this administration is just going after, that was like the clearest state, you know. Both Robbie and Gene had orders of deportation, but Maru didn't, and here we are just in the situation where they're going after her. We still don't know what's gonna happen. She's luckily she hasn't been detained, but there's also been a lot of support for her case. And the last person is Eliseo Jurado, who's the husband of sanctuary leader Ingrid Encalada La Torre in Colorado. You might have heard about her. And he was shopping with his family at a Safeway and was targeted by ICE and detained. So he was just at the grocery store and was detained, and he's a part, again, of an activist community. So I was, you know, in thinking about, and he's currently still detained as far as I know, in thinking about just embodied carcerality, there's one thing to be an immigrant in the US and be targeted under this like very white supremacist, fascist leader right now, with a history of a country that, you know, built on slavery, etc. And then it's one thing to sort of go that, and I think, you know, other folks have mentioned this too, go that other step of being an activist within this resistance. And now what we've seen, I mean, this is not something that was actually happening much under the Obama administration. One of the shifts we've seen is this retaliation for activism, retaliation for this work, and we also see it inside the detention centers. I mean, some of the greatest activists we've seen are hunger strikers inside who are really, you know, there's no other way to protest, and so that's one of the things we're seeing from the Trump administration is also just a lot of retaliation inside, which we also saw under Obama. So just to say, I think, you know, I'll close on saying, you know, I think it's been a tough time. It's been a tough year to just see not only the policies change, but the sort of visceral experience in the U.S. with the hate group, you know, the rise of the hate groups, et cetera, and just this comfort in every, you know, very vocal racism that is happening. But I also think there's opportunities in being in this sort of extreme moment to push people to say, okay, what are we really trying to do here? We don't have to ask for the bare minimum, which was what the Obama era was about. We can ask for the thing that we really want. And because of this moment, I think there's a clarity that we haven't had before, or maybe a lot of people I'm sure have, but I think there's a clarity that we can sort of push to say, no, we don't believe anybody should be detained. We don't believe anybody should be incarcerated. And we're not going to stop fighting. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for this exhilarating, I like panel we run a little over time, but I'm hoping that people are going to be cool with at least 10 minutes of Q&A, because there is a lunch that's being served, hot lunch. You can see they're starting to set up here, so don't worry, food is coming very soon. And I wanted to also remind people that after the lunch there is an annual general, no?
It's actually, the lunch is taking place during our AGM. So welcome people who are going to be here for our AGM to have lunch.
You mean you have to go to the AGM if you want to be fed?
That was the idea.
Okay. Those are the rules. I didn't make them up.
Sorry, we get people to this AGM.
Anyway, before we close that, I wanted to open the floor up to anybody who wants to ask a question of our panelists. And I see a question over here.
Okay, so this is, so basically, as far as surveillance, one of the things I was going through is, I don't like Edward Snowden, and I don't like Julian Assange, not because they expose information, but because populations of color have been under surveillance for a very long time, and we've had to basically deal with that mantle as our responsibility as citizens in, the United States and Canada. So how do you think we'll be able to turn the narrative from, oh my gosh, the government is watching me, to the government has been watching those people. It matters when the government watches everybody, not just you.
Should we take a couple of questions and then see what happens? Okay, yeah, let's take another one. Thank you for that question. We have another one from the floor. Okay, right in the back. You can just yell out because we don't have any mics flying around.
Yeah.
I'm gonna yell. This is a question for Jasmine. I was thinking when you were talking about self-surveillance and like Muslim youth, one thing came to my mind, which is from an old documentary, an interview with Leila Khaled, and the person who made the movie who's interviewing her is also a Palestinian woman. She's a Palestinian Swedish woman, and her mentality right off the bat is that she doesn't like what she did, which was Leila Khaled, people don't know, and she hijacked a flight.
Is this better? My voice is definitely quiet, I can't yell. Yeah, so Leila Khaled hijacked a plane back in, I guess, 60s, sometime in the 60s, I can't remember the exact date. But the movie was called The Hijacker, Leila Khaled, The Hijacker. So she was, the woman who made the movie, she wanted to ask Leila Khaled this question, which I don't think she ever asked, but she talks about it in the movie, that she wanted to ask her, do you understand that you gave us a bad reputation for what you did? And this came to my mind as you were talking about this kind of inward gaze of surveillance. And I absolutely cringed at that in the movie. I completely reject. I feel that it's an insult to someone like Leila Khaled, someone of that, someone who sacrificed so much. And I see that happening a lot amongst Muslim Middle Eastern communities, that we sort of start criminalizing the things that we have to do for resistance because of these stereotypes, because we're trying to escape being criminalized, but it ends up, curtailing those acts of resistance that we know we must do. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that kind of how to frame it, just really giving up on even the ideas of resistance because we don't want to be seen as terrorists, because it's the wrong framing. Terrorist just means you're resisting. That's all it means, and it's a lie. It's a fabrication. So we shouldn't fall for that. That's my thing. Thank you.
Okay, so do you want to start? Oh, we have one more question. Okay.
So thank you all very much. Wonderful way to bring us all together at the end of the conference. Dr. Bear, I was thinking when you're speaking, and as I was hearing the other colleagues, about Deanne Million's talk, and the difference between Deanne Million and Kim Pate, who working very hard within the system, but Deanne Million kept on saying, I'm starting somewhere else. And you talked about, we have so much to learn, in our Western epistemologies, our Western bureaucracies, our Western practices, from indigenous epistemologies and activism. So I'm wondering if you could, I'd like to hear more about that, especially we're in this quandary of trying to rework the systems, expanding surveillance. But I kept on thinking of what Deanne Million was saying, where she says with her echo, she starts with everything is alive, and then there's care. And then also Joy James, who talked about this generative possibility. So I know it's kind of big and open, but I wanted to turn to you to that.
I think we're going to answer these questions now. So I don't know who wants to start. Do you want to start, Tracy?
That would be great, because I might forget what she
Okay,
said.
good.
Well, this works, right? Okay, we have two working mics up here. Thank you for your question, and thank you for the latte earlier. I'm grateful you asked that question. It is surrounded in the Cree concept of what go to win, and that is the idea that we are all related, and that we have that accountability and responsibility. And the primary difference, and this is a generalization, between what I see and Western thought and for my own Cree, as a Cree woman, is this idea of individualism versus collectivism. And so as Indigenous people have moved to urban centers, it's been very difficult to push back against that idea of individualism when you have this your family homes, you have the heterosexual couple with the 1.5 kids, and you have the dog, and then the extended kinship networks. Where's the place for that? And so for much of my family, we do live in extended family situations. And so when we say our family, I'm not just talking about my mom and dad and my sisters and brothers. I am talking about my aunties and their cousins, my second cousins and my grandparents. At any time they could come and live. And so that is, I think, a line that I see. So what happens when you do have that individual sort of ideas, you have this, it's interesting, the intersections of surveillance. So when you have these families living in these little homes peeking out their windows, and you don't have accountability in the way that I see accountability showing up in sort of my culture and aspects of my culture, not everywhere, obviously. And so there is that ethos that I've come under the understanding of believing that I have this responsibility, not just to my small kinship, but my larger extended kinship networks, my larger Cree people networks and communities across Canada, and then now extending down into the States, and then globally, the colonial experience of Maori, the Sami, the Hawaiians, and all of these people. Those are really extended kinship networks that we have partnerships and collaborations with, just on the very notion of the colonial legacy that we have all gone through and continue to go through. So those kinship networks are really quite wide and vast. I don't consider that kinship so narrow. And so when I think about that, and when I do presentations like this, and when the research that I do, and how I step in this earth, and how I walk on this land, I have to be accountable. I have to think about all those things that I'm doing. And like Margaret Kovacs said, if you look and walk into my hotel, I bump into all sorts of my brothers and sisters in 2 blocks right here. And that whole idea of looking into their faces and they're looking into mine, what are you doing to help us? What are you doing? And so it's not just a theory of resilience and resistance that I look at, but the practice of it as well, and how we go about ourselves in our daily lives.
Thank you for those two questions about the sort of perpetual nature of surveillance for marginalized, racialized groups, as well as the internalization of that gaze, of the sort of the panopticon of self-surveillance that I was talking about. And I think just in response, going back to this notion that I had around the security archipelago and the factors around, you know, how we respond to these ideologies of risks, and how it, you know, these specific securitized conditions that we're responding to, and how that it creates certain kinds of identities, of habitus, of dispositions, of even bodily comportment. You know, one of the quotes that I read was about, you know, how do I look at the, you know, when I'm at the airport, how do I look less threatening? How do I comport in a way that won't elicit the kind of threat that's there? And so, you know, what does it mean? What kind of affects are produced? What does it mean to internalize all of that? And you know, what I've seen in terms of community is that there's an annual radicalization conference that is organized by a group in Toronto, a Somali organization called Medenta. And every year there is Homeland Security there is CSIS there is RCMP, not because they're infiltrating, but they were invited, right? They are invited members of it. And I always, you know, the head of this organization always invites me for lunch and like, please tell us, you know, advise us, and everything I tell them they just don't follow. Because I said, clear out the security people. How do we have a conversation that isn't securitized? I haven't been to a Muslim gathering to talk about, you know, questions around Muslim youth or any of these things that we are confronting that doesn't have some representation of security communities. And I just find it baffling and troubling that we're the ones inviting them in. And then I kept asking the director of this organization, and he finally said to me, he said, you know, well, we don't want to have happen to us what happened to, like, it was the Canadian Arab Federation that lost their funding, you know. They are afraid of that. So they have to play, it's the good Muslim, bad Muslim game. And so they're playing into that good Muslim game to show that, well, we're the good ones, we're working with public safety, we're attending the security roundtables, you know, we're inviting you into our forums, we've got nothing to hide. And, you know, and so that's one dynamic that gets, you know, internalized within the community and reproduces as a result of that. But it's also a strategy of, you know, wanting to make sure that you're not the next group that's going to be suspect, that's going to lose its funding, that's going to be on the terror watch list. So I think that's, you know, one thing that, you know, definitely see happening. And then I think it's just the heightened security risks that are always, the factors that are always being purveyed, whether it's about terrorism or radicalization, all of these things that, you know, there's no real specific even definition that you can draw from, or that security communities are drawing on this notion of radicalization. So much is mapped into it and can be read into what do you mean by radical? Does that mean that, you know, if your neighbor grows a beard or starts wearing a niqab, is that a sign of radicalization? So there's no real specificity in the discourse and understandings of these security communities in terms of how they are, you know, operationalizing that term. But, you know, just what we see, I don't watch TV very often, but this morning at the hotel I was listening and there was a commercial for some kind of you know, surveillance system that you can, you know, because you're being monitored at home and your computer and your kids aren't safe, and there's this now military grade security networking that you can get to protect you. And I was just like, alarming, you know, it's like, wow, do I need this, you know? So I think that the normalization of, on the one hand, the normalization of Islamophobia and the normalization of the security state are converging in particular ways that brought us to where we are now. And I think we have to just be very aware of what it means for young people, for youth to be socialized into this, you know, sort of carceral culture and into this securitized, you know, state and into the kind of ontologies that they're developing. But, you know, I didn't get a chance to talk about resistance, but I do in my book. I have a final chapter that looks at how Muslim youth are resisting all of these marginalities through the arts. And just, I want to close by saying, to me, that is a really generative space and a positive space, and I think it's, you know, important for us to look at where those spaces of resistance come in. Even the small acts of subversion, right? It doesn't have to be the big revolution, but it's the small acts of subversion that people are doing in their everyday life anyways to try and combat the conditions they're dealing with. And I am, if anything, energized and inspired by a lot of the youth who are out there who are responding to this through, particularly through the arts, and I think that that's a positive, you know, note for me.
Just to mention on the sort of where do we go with the prisons piece. I just on the surveillance piece, like I feel like there was a moment where under the Obama administration there was this question of like, okay, there's going to be potentially more prison reform in the U.S. and a desire from the Justice Department to shift what was happening with federal prisons, and at some level, what ended up it ended up feeling like we were going to move more towards a surveillance model. So that fear of, okay, we have all these prisons now, but actually it's a little bit more efficient for us to have a lot of people on ankle shackles because it's less money, and that's where we're going to go. So I think there's like the surveillance state that is present for people who, like prior to coming into the system, and then like once they leave the system, and sort of the fear of just sort of like how all those spaces are interacting. And I think that's one thing that I've been very cautious of, again, because under Obama it was like, okay, alternatives, and it's like, actually, no, this is gonna lend itself to more people being under surveillance state.
I'm sorry, I'm gonna close the floor to questions just because we have to, we do have to end at some point. It seems very sad. So first I wanna say a huge thank you to this inspiring panel, an inspiring group of people doing amazing work. And I have the bizarre position of being the last person to speak publicly at this thing. Maybe somebody's going to speak over lunch, I'll be good. But I just want to say that this has been exhilarating, inspiring, did I say exhausting? It's actually, I feel as though this has been an important event, this conference. I don't, and I'll just speak personally, I don't remember another conference where I cried so often. And so and it's not just tears of despair, although there were those too, right? It's like, are you kidding me? Like, that's another bad thing I didn't know. But also tears of inspiration and joy. And, you know, part of what we're talking about here, and this is just me summing up in a kind of cheesy way, but I feel the need to do that, is on the one hand, detention, incarceration, isolation, but also I'm thinking about Tracy Barrett's invocation of the notion of a colonialism, which is to be with one's relations, and homelessness as being without one's relations. So, in the work that we can do together, we are building networks and kinships. So we are with one another in any way. So I want to thank you all for all of your work and the ways I've been inspired by it all. So one more, we just clapped a lot, but let's just do it again. And there's an Indian buffet and an AGM.
And thank you very much.